Hello, and welcome back to Scrum Master course. Now let's take a closer look at the processes and how they work. You probably remember hearing that a project has a product backlog of prioritized requirements, as well as a product owner who is responsible for prioritizing these requirements. Now the question is, how do you get this work done? First of all, let's define the Scrum processes in general. Scrum processes address the specific activities and flow of a Scrum project. In total, there are 19 processes, which are grouped into 5 phases. These phases are presented in chapters 8 through 12 of the SBOT guide. These 5 phases describe each process in detail, including the associated inputs, tools, and outputs. Also, in each process, some inputs, tools, and outputs are designated as mandatory, while others are designated as optional. The decision to include any optional input, tool, and/or output depends on the particular project, organization, or industry. Inputs and outputs denoted as mandatory are important for the successful implementation of Scrum in any organization. Next, we'll take a closer look at the phases and the processes enlisted under them. Initiate is the first phase, and the processes carried out as part of Initiate are as follows. Create project vision is the first process performed. In this process, the project business case is reviewed to create a project vision statement that will serve as the inspiration and provide focus for the entire project. The product owner is identified in this process. Identify Scrum Master and stakeholders is the second process, during which the Scrum Master is identified using specific selection criteria. Form Scrum Team is the third process in the Initiate phase. In this process, Scrum team members are identified. Normally, the product owner has the primary responsibility of selecting team members, but he or she often chooses the team in collaboration with the Scrum Master. The fourth process is Develop Epics. In this process, the project vision statement serves as the basis for developing epics, which are large, unrefined user stories. User group meetings may be held to develop epics. Create a prioritized product backlog is the next process. In this process, epics and unrefined user stories are refined and elaborated, then prioritized to create a prioritized product backlog for the project. The done criteria is also established at this point. The last process classified under the Initiate phase is Conduct Release Planning. In this process, the Scrum core team reviews the user stories in the prioritized product backlog to develop a release planning schedule, which is essentially a phased deployment schedule that can be shared with the project stakeholders. The second phase we're going to learn is Plan and Estimate, and these are processes grouped under this phase. First is Create User Stories. We can see that in this process, user stories and their related user story acceptance criteria are created. User stories are usually written by the product owner and are designed to ensure that the customer's requirements are clearly depicted and can be fully understood by all the stakeholders. User story writing exercises may be held. This involves Scrum team members creating the user stories. User stories are incorporated into the prioritized product backlog.
Now let's look at the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of Estimate and Commit User Stories process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and User Stories. For a detailed explanation of these inputs, please refer to the discussions on these in the Create User Stories process. The tool that is to be mandatorily used as part of this process is estimation methods. Numerous estimation methods can be used as tools to estimate user stories. Some important tools are, let's begin with Wideband Delphi. Wideband Delphi is a group-based estimation technique for determining how much work is involved and how long it will take to complete. Individuals within a team anonymously provide estimations for each item, and the initial estimates are plotted on a chart. The team then discusses the factors that influence their estimates and proceed to a second round of estimation. This process is repeated until the estimates of individuals are close to each other and a consensus for the final estimates can be reached. The second technique is planning poker. It is also called estimation poker. It is a derivative of the wideband Delphi technique. This is an estimation technique which uses consensus to estimate relative sizes of user stories or the effort required to create them. Next technique is Fist of Five. It is a simple and fast mechanism that can be used as an estimation practice as well as a general group consensus building technique. After initial discussion on a given item for estimation, the Scrum team members are each asked to vote on a scale of 1 to 5 using their fingers. Used as an estimation tool, the number of fingers displayed indicate the relative estimation value. The value in using this technique is not only consensus building, but also driving discussion because team members are asked to explain the reason for their estimates. Used as a general consensus building technique, the proposal or pending decision under consideration is initially discussed. Then, the team members vote based on their level of agreement and desire for discussion. If a team member raises one finger, it means he or she disagrees with the group's conclusion and has major concerns. If a team member raises two fingers, it means he or she disagrees with the group's conclusion and would like to discuss some minor issues. If a team member raises three fingers, it means he or she is not sure and would like to go with the group's consensus conclusion. If a team member raises four fingers, it means he or she agrees with the group's conclusion and would like to discuss some minor issues. And if a team member raises five fingers, it means he or she wholeheartedly agrees with the group's conclusion. The last technique is affinity estimation. It is a technique used to quickly estimate a large number of user stories. Using sticky notes or index cards and tape, the team places user stories on a wall or other surface in order from small to large. For this, each team member begins with a subset of user stories from the overall prioritized product backlog to place by relative size. This initial placement is done in silence. Once everyone has placed their user stories on the wall, the team reviews all of the placements and may move user stories around as appropriate. The second part of the exercise involves discussion. Finally, the product owner will indicate some sizing categories on the wall. These categories can be small, medium, or large, or they may be numbered using story point values to indicate relative size. The team will then move user stories into these categories as the final step in the process. Some key benefits of this approach are that the process is very transparent, visible to everyone, and is easy to conduct. The mandatory output of this process is estimated user stories. After the user stories are estimated by the Scrum team using the various estimation techniques discussed in this section, they are considered to be estimated user stories. The next process is commit user stories. The mandatory inputs of this process are Scrum core team, estimated user stories, and length of sprint. For detailed explanation of these inputs, please refer to the discussion on them in Develop Epics, Estimate User Stories, and Conduct Release Planning Processes. The mandatory tools used in this process are Sprint Planning Meeting and Communication Techniques. The Sprint Planning Meeting is used by the Scrum team in the Commit User Stories process to plan the work to be done in the sprint. The team reviews the estimated user stories in order to commit the user stories which they can deliver within the sprint. The next tool is Communication Techniques. Scrum promotes accurate and effective communication primarily through co-location of the Scrum team. Scrum also favors informal, face-to-face interactions over formal written communications. When a Scrum team needs to be distributed, the Scrum Master should ensure that effective communication techniques are available so that the team can self-organize, collaborate, and work effectively. The mandatory output of this process is committed user stories. The Scrum team commits to a subset of estimated user stories that they believe they can complete in the next sprint based upon velocity. The committed user stories should also be selected per the priorities defined by the product owner. Now let's discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of Identify Task process. The mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of this process are Scrum Core Team, Committed User Stories, Task Planning Meetings, and Task List, respectively. Please refer to the discussion on the mandatory inputs of the Create User Stories and Estimate User Stories processes for a better understanding of Scrum Core Team. The tool that must be used mandatorily in this process is sprint planning meetings. In sprint planning meetings, the Scrum team plans the work to be done in the sprint by reviewing the committed user stories at the top of the prioritized product backlog. The product owner is present during this meeting to clear ambiguities related to user stories in the prioritized product backlog. This meeting should be time-boxed with the standard length limited to 2 hours per week of the sprint duration. This assists in preventing the tendency to stray into discussions that should actually occur in other meetings, like the release planning or sprint review meetings. The mandatory output of this process is task list. The task list is a comprehensive list that contains all the tasks to which the Scrum team has committed for the current sprint. It contains description of each task along with estimates derived during the create task process. The task list must include any testing and integration efforts so that the product increment from the sprint can be successfully integrated into the deliverables from previous sprints. Even though tasks are often activity-based, the level of granularity to which the tasks are decomposed is decided by the Scrum team. Now let's discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Estimate Tasks process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and Task List, whereas the mandatory tools are sprint planning meetings, estimation criteria, and estimation methods. And the mandatory output is the Effort Estimated Task List. For a good understanding of the mandatory inputs of this process, please refer to the discussion on the inputs of the Create User Stories process and to the discussion on the output of the Identify Task process. The tools that must be mandatorily used in this process are sprint planning meetings and estimation criteria. In sprint planning meetings, the Scrum team members use the task list to estimate the duration and effort for the user stories to be completed in the sprint. One of the key benefits of this technique is that it enables the team to have a shared perspective on the user stories and requirements so they can reliably estimate the effort required. The information gathered in the sprint planning meeting is included in the effort estimated task list and used to determine the velocity for the sprint. The next tool is estimation criteria. Estimation criteria can be expressed in numerous ways, with two common examples being story points and ideal time. Story point values are used to represent relative or comparative effort to complete tasks, whereas ideal time normally describes the number of hours a Scrum team member works exclusively on developing the project's deliverables, without including any time spent on other activities or work that is outside the project. Estimation criteria make it easier for the Scrum team to estimate effort and enable them to evaluate and address inefficiencies when necessary. The last mandatory tool is estimation methods. For a good understanding of this tool, please refer to the discussion on it in the Estimate User Stories process. The mandatory output of this process is Effort Estimated Task List. The Effort Estimated Task List is a list of tasks associated with the committed user stories included in a sprint. Typically, the accuracy of estimates varies with team skills. Estimated effort is expressed in terms of estimation criteria agreed on by the team. The Effort Estimated Task List is used by the Scrum team during sprint planning meetings to create the sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart. It is also used to determine when the team needs to reduce its commitment or can take on additional user stories during sprint planning.